Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, there are 68.5 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. Of these, 25.4 million are refugees. 68% of all the refugees come from just 5 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. Even though they are hosted by several countries, many of them aim for one final destination: Europe. The European Union declared a refugee crisis in 2015. The crisis intensified as thousands kept pouring into the continent. EU member states have failed to agree on a solution, with increased political tension as a result. But whose fault is this crisis? And are all the countries in the world doing enough to ease the situation, or are only a few carrying the burden? We find out as Amin Awad, Director for the Middle East and North Africa Bureau of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, talks to Al Jazeera. Mr. Amin Awad, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Now, you are Director for the Middle East and North Africa Bureau and Regional Refugee Coordinator for Syria and Iraq at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Office. That's quite a long title. Just explain that to us, what your job involves, what it is that you do.
My job is a very difficult one. I manage the crisis of the Middle East, the wars of the Middle East, and the consequences of war are the 20+ million internally displaced Syrian, Iraqis, Yemenis, Libyans, and others, plus the refugees are coming out of Syria and Iraq, Libya, and other places. The situation in the Middle East is not really looking up when it comes to wars and destruction. And there is a lot of work to be done in the humanitarian front, leave alone when we talk about the return of Syrian refugees, for example, internally displaced persons. Again, we're looking at 13 million people that should go back to their homes. This will be the biggest return since World War II also. And it requires a lot of work on the legal side of things, on the security side of things, on stabilization, on recovery, on reintegration, and stabilization throughout the country, and shelter, home, property, land, and physical security for people to go back. That's what I do.
It's been just over 3 years now since we saw that huge migration of people to Europe from places like Syria and Iraq and other countries in the region that really hit the headlines globally. How would you assess this then going forward? I mean, are we over a hump, or have we reached a kind of new normal with this situation?
A new normal, no. As far as the Syria situation, I think that's what you're asking. I think we have new elements. The war, by and large, is stopped. The hostilities in many parts of the country is stopped. Idlib remain there, and I hope that a peaceful solution will be found for Idlib, that a war does not break out over Idlib, as we have seen in Aleppo, Homs, and other places, because that will be a disaster. However, there's a lot of groundwork to be done to create conditions conducive for return, for stabilization, and to remove obstacles for return. These are legal, protection, security, livelihood, housing, water, sanitation, health, food security. So there's a lot to be done to really, once a conflict stops, to start rebuilding people's life.
And in terms of which countries are doing their fair share, I mean, if we look at Syria, for example, it certainly seems that Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey are really taking the brunt of this in terms of the numbers of refugees that they have taken in. But a lot of people will be asking, why aren't other countries stepping in here, particularly other Arab Gulf countries? And since we're talking about a global problem here as well, why not countries in Asia like China, wealthy countries like South Korea and Japan, for example? Shouldn't they be stepping up more here?
The Syria war wasn't a local one, was not a regional, was global. The power that maybe were involved in that war. Since the beginning of the war, and our repeated appeal from the beginning of the year, the UN and other international organizations received about $20 billion. $20 billion went into Syria and the surrounding countries. That's still not enough because the appeals were much, much higher, 5 times higher than that. Now, I think the international community have paid to a certain extent generously for the Syria situation, but they may not...
Sorry, when you talk about the international community, who are you talking about?
Talking about the traditional donors, what we call traditional donors.
Like?
The European Union, the member state of European Union, the Arab world, thanks to the 5 countries, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and plus Turkey, that they have received the 5 plus 6 million refugees. And others have contributed to the Syria cause. But we also have Iraq, we have Libya, we have Yemen, we have many other crises in Africa that goes silent. People are also in many places facing problems and shortages of funding. Not every appeal by the UN, for example, is receiving the funds that they receive. Some of them, they're receiving 7, 8, 10%.
And why is that?
Well, I think there ought to be a new international order when it comes to humanitarian assistance to stabilize people in their communities. People do not move to cross continents or countries or international boundaries to go from one place to another. I think assistance should be given to proximity, in the proximity of where crises are, and the international community, the donors that may be, have to act more responsibly in addressing these crises in a full and comprehensive manner, not in a partial manner.
Well, you must have had discussions with your member nations, or maybe you haven't, I don't know, about the burden that some of these countries are sharing. I mean, if we take, for example, the case of South Korea and Yemeni asylum seekers, who a number of them went to South Korea. What happened there in June is that they removed Yemen from the list of countries that allowed visa-free access to the island of Jeju in South Korea. How do you square that with the responsibility that the international community, as you say, has to them?
That's what it proves exactly what I said. Had there been enough support to avert the crisis that's happening in Yemen today, financially and otherwise, to arrest the spread of famine and diseases in Yemen, we would not have had this migration out and far beyond continents, across continents to a place like South Korea.
There are many displaced people from the Middle East who tell us that going to other Arab countries is not an option for them, because in many of these countries they're likely to face more repression and hostility from people. I mean, refugees arriving in Egypt from Syria, for example, have been met with suspicion, discrimination, violence. We've heard lots of stories, and I'm sure your organization has heard the same. So Europe is still a more attractive option for them. What's being done to address that then?
Well, if you look at the 5.5, close to 6 million, those are 5.5 registered with UNHCR. There could be another 500,000 that are not registered for a reason or another, who checked into Egypt, which you just mentioned, a case in point. From my visit to Egypt, they had access to education, health. They were living among the population, not in camps, in the bellies of towns and villages and countryside, and in the countryside of Egypt.
When did you last visit Egypt? Because things have changed somewhat since President Sisi
during the last 3 or 4 years, during the last 5 years, I visited Cairo maybe about a dozen times. And not only Cairo, I went to Alexandria, suburbs, villages. I met people in their home communities, in apartments, in collective centers. I have inspected that, and as we do also in Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq. I think by and large, the 5.5 million people that came out of Syria, they were received very well in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq. There could be exceptions. There could be exceptions also in Europe. I don't want to paint a picture of Europe as being the heaven, and the last destination. No, also there could be discrimination, isolated cases here and there. We see in Germany there were some hostility in some areas because of the vast numbers of people who came, not only from Syria but from other countries. So I think on balance, for us the most precious thing is countries open their border to allow people to come in from persecution, war, and killing, and that happened in this very important instance of the Syria influx.
There is an argument as well that says with this movement of so many people, many of them are not really refugees but economic migrants. How do you make that distinction then?
Economic migrants, they're going for a better life, looking for jobs. Refugees are escaping persecution, wars, destruction, physical security. They're running for their lives. That's what makes a difference. Refugees are entitled to cross borders into safety.
But what's the process that's involved in making
there
that
would
decision?
be a standard refugee status determination to interview those people and see where they're coming from, and if there are indeed wars and if they're really fleeing persecution. Once that they confirm they're asylum seekers, they're refugees. Migrants are fleeing conditions that standard or poverty, and they're looking for better life. We should not discriminate against them, because also there are conventions. There are conventions that, like the Convention on the Refugees, governing the movement of people, migrants for economic, and there are policies, and they should be treated with humanity and dignity, and they should not be abused, and they should not be manipulated or instrumentalized in their journeys for a better life.
There's been some discussion as well among European nations about setting up a kind of central processing center somewhere in North Africa. Morocco has been talked about as
migrants, not for
yes,
refugees.
for migrants. That's right. Where does the UNHCR stand on that, particularly since this has come under some criticism in that Europe is seen as abdicating its responsibility at a time when migrant flows are much lower than they were in 2015. What's your view on that?
Well, these are discussions that are going on between the European Union on the one hand and the North African states, the bilateral. So we are not really in the middle of that. But also there are discussions that are going on between individual states in the EU, in the European Union, in that continent, with these countries. And I think what the Europeans are trying to do is to share the burden of the hundreds of thousands or millions that have crossed during the last few years, and try to diversify the locations where processing centers can be put up.
Are they shirking their responsibilities?
Who?
The European nations.
They saw that during the last few years they received millions. And they believe that many countries in Africa were transit countries, where we know some countries like Egypt became a destination and transit. In other words, some people come and remain in Egypt, and some try to go further. So many countries in North Africa became destination, but all a transit. So not only Europe. I think there is a way for the Europeans and the North Africans and others in the continent to really find a way out of this. The way out of this is really a policy, robust policies to govern the assistance that the rich North that can give to Sub-Saharan Africa or North Africa in order to stabilize this population. The second thing, the world have to come up with a very robust, comprehensive system to fight and contain smuggling and trafficking. Smugglers, traffickers are coordinating as groups, as gangs, with those who are trading on arms and in drugs. And you have the people on those that we're talking about who are trading in smuggling and trafficking of human beings. They share intelligence, they share resources, they exchange heavy weapons, and they're bent on doing their controlling the three areas I just mentioned: drugs, people, and weapons. This is very destabilizing for the world at large, and this is billions of dollars of trade. If the world does not come up with a mechanism to control this and put it as one of the most important agenda items today on the top of the world agenda, I think the situation will get worse and worse. And what you have mentioned of what the EU wants to do with North Africa becomes really marginal and a drop in the ocean action that with no substance and no sustainable impact.
What are these countries doing to address that? I mean, are they listening to the UNHCR, and what kind of access are you and your staff getting to some of these places?
We don't deal with migration as such. We don't deal with these problems as I told you. But this affects also movement of people.
But it's tied into
and it's tied
refugees.
Into that. And among that, there is a very small number of asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution. You will find among these massive tsunami of people who are moving from one place to another for a better life, or simply because traffickers and smugglers have provoked communities to move. If I tell you that people are moving in Yemen today from the Horn of Africa across the Red Sea, you'll be surprised why people will go into a war zone when there is famine, cholera, diseases, and no job opportunities and insecurity because of a good business model by the traffickers and smugglers. They're poor, they're not educated. They were promised heaven to come to Yemen. They don't even know the extent of war in Yemen. And they crossed the sea and they found themselves in that situation. They paid whatever their life saving, they sold their land, their animals. They got there somehow.
So what's being done then in those discussions that you're having with these member nations to try to try to combat that?
These are done in different platforms on migration and on people trafficking. These are international criminal acts, if you like. And I think the European Union with the UN and other nations that are concerned and part of these routes have to really come up with better policies and better action plans to contain this problem.
Reports that some European countries, in particular Italy, have been paying money to the government in Libya to distribute to the militias in the country to try and keep migrants and refugees from fleeing to Europe. Is this something that the UN is looking at? And isn't this essentially a violation of migrant law and what's being done about it?
I've heard the same, but really we're not the quarter to address that. The UN have many arms, the international community have to work in different ways to verify this first, if it's true or not, and to find ways to. From the outset, it's not something that we will intervene with. The government of Italy, the militias in Libya, the Libyan government, we're out of that loop. But
the UN is presumably in a position, isn't it, to apply some
this has to be
pressure,
verified. If they really, if there are a group of people stopped from moving forward, let's say if they're fleeing persecution, of course that's wrong. But for us, there is no way for us to verify that. That is.
I want to turn back to Yemen. There is this perception that other Arab nations in that region, particularly in the Gulf, are not doing more to address that situation. What do you say to that?
I think if you allow me to speak about Yemen, I don't think it's one group of countries or another. There is a humanitarian disaster in the making. The world is watching this. And one day, the world will wake up to find out that we have went through one of the worst famine crises of our time. The world have to act, not one region or another, internationally to contain this problem, to reverse the situation. There is a need for huge humanitarian intervention here to really reverse that famine, the cholera and other diseases, and the health systems, the education, and the welfare of the Yemeni people as a whole. As it's a whole nation that's going through a crisis, and the world is watching that. That has to stop.
When you look at Yemen, they share a long border with Saudi Arabia, so a lot of people will be asking why isn't, I mean, Saudi Arabia is obviously a very wealthy country, why isn't Saudi Arabia doing more to address what is going on?
Well, first of all, that war have to stop. Saudi Arabia or not, other countries have to come to the assistance of the Yemeni people. Now, what is being done is not enough to avert a crisis with this at this scale.
What role has technology played in all of this, in this digital age where information is very readily available? People have smartphones and devices. There is an ability to navigate and to know more easily where to go compared with, say, 20 or 30 years ago. How much of a factor is that in people's decision to migrate, and how does that affect the situation? Because, you know, many decades ago, a lot of people didn't exactly know where the best place was to go. Has that made the situation more challenging for you?
In a way, those who are educated at a certain level of education and they have these devices to guide them where to go, of course they can. I think the new technology and innovation, we're using it to deliver better humanitarian assistance. But I'm afraid that the new technology and innovation that's used more for smarter guns and wars, and that is, it doesn't really balance it out as simple as that.
What's been the impact of the Trump travel ban on the refugee situation in this region? Because a lot of many of those countries that were on that list are Middle Eastern countries.
The resettlement. Well, the quotas that we had from the U.S., we only realized about 20% of it, and we hope that the U.S. policy reverses the decision and that we have more space to really send people on resettlement and have that generosity of the U.S. and the U.S. people of receiving people traditionally. It's a migrating nation itself. It's a destination. And it has been like that for many years, for 200 years. So we're hoping that the U.S. will open its quota again for Syrian refugees and others.
How hopeful are you of that at the moment, given this current climate?
I am sure everything will take time, but it will happen.
What's being done specifically to address that? Is there any pressure being applied?
We are in negotiation with the U.S. government at all levels. We are in the communities with the department that traditionally have been engaged with us for the last few decades. So when the time is opportune, I'm sure, like any other policy, that could be reversed or amended.
Another thing that's in the news right now is this Central American caravan that is going through, making its way through Mexico right now and is intending to get to the United States. I know this is outside of your region, but this is something that President Trump has talked about quite a bit. It's been an issue, a political issue there at the moment. How would you have handled that situation?
As far as I'm concerned, those who are leaving Honduras probably living under distress. I think the situation there, security-wise, for many segment of the population, especially the young and the children, is not conducive, and there ought to be a system to contain that lawlessness and stabilize the situation for people not to leave their homes and cross international borders.
But it is very much a kind of hot button issue at the moment. Is there not a responsibility on the part of the richer nations like the United States to take in people who are fleeing war and likely death and poverty and so on?
For sure, but I would look at it definitely. That's have to happen. Of course, people are seeking international support, but there could be today's caravan, and tomorrow there could be second and third, and the 10th and the 100 and 1,000 caravan, like as we see the movement across the Mediterranean. We have to find out what are the root causes. The root causes are within reach to solve. There are lawlessness created by many elements, and that have to be reversed for people to be, for the population to be stabilized.
I want to come back to the issue we talked about earlier about burden sharing and this idea that a number of nations, richer nations, bigger nations, are not doing their fair share in trying to help the situation here. One of the number of countries that comes up is Singapore, a wealthy nation, or a small nation but a wealthy nation. Russia as well. We don't hear much about Russian assistance for any refugees, either from the Middle East or anywhere else. Why isn't more being done to address that?
There isn't much done to address that. I agree with you. I think I talked before about world orders that cemented the way they were since post-World War II. I think that have to change. The world have to come together, reconfigure all of this mechanism when it comes to international response, when it comes to humanitarian action, when it comes to burden sharing, responsibility sharing, and find a more equitable way for the Arab Gulf, for the Singapore of this world, for the Korea you mentioned before, and other countries to really contribute in an equitable manner. Many countries have a percentage of their GDP and make that contribution in a consistent manner, and some others don't. So things are not equal. That's the way the world it is. It has to change.
But I mean, if you look at a country like Russia, for example, it's one of the superpowers in the world. Why don't we hear more about Russia and why they're not doing? I mean, we hear a lot about the U.S. and the assistance that they are giving. We don't hear much about Russian assistance.
Because, as I said, they were assessed contribution that they make, which is a percentage of their GDP, of their income, 1% or less that they put out every year, and it's distributed to different crises, be it economic, environmental, humanitarian, or others. The world doesn't act like that in concert. Some other countries or parts of the world does not act like that. And there ought to be a new order to make that contribution, this burden sharing, more equitable among them. The number of countries that contribute, for example, to all of these crises is not more than 15. And the countries that, as you mentioned earlier, that are capable and able to pay and not doing so are more than the 15. So it's left to a very small number of countries that they cannot meet the demand of humanity. And these demands are increasing every year as the crisis deepens, as the crisis becomes protracted in different parts of the world, as the world population explodes. So you have more people on the move for economic reasons, for humanitarian reasons, and the number of donors remains the same. That pool of countries have to expand in order for them to be able to pay for these appeals.
Mr. Amin Awad, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.